Shavua Tov. I'd like to dedicate this shiur to the memory of Tze'ela Gez, Zichronah Livracha, Hashem Yikom Dama, who was murdered last week on the road to the delivery room in Shomron. And I think that at a moment where a monstrous act like that is committed against one of Am Yisrael, there are a lot of different appropriate things to think, and some maybe have more to do with how we can prevent something like that from ever happening again. But I think also it's a moment where it's natural to be caused to reflect on how we understand our situation in a world ruled by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when things of such devastating cruelty can happen to those who are righteous and who are innocent. And obviously the last 2 years has been a period for Am Yisrael where there's been no shortage of examples of those kinds of occurrences. And of course, there were strings of hundreds or thousands beforehand as well, going back decades and further, even just here in the land of Israel. But I think that when an individual case like this comes to one's attention, where the details are so sharp and so poignant, it especially pulls one to contemplation of some of the most difficult questions about how HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs this world that he created. Because when massive events like the attack on Shmini Atzeret at the start of this war take place, I don't know if it's fair to say that it's easier to contemplate things in different terms because it has to do with groups, it has to do with motions of nations and of armies, things that pull many people up or sweep people up into them. And one would never want to say, therefore, that one doesn't see or remember or recognize the individuals that are caught up in a moment like that. And so in one sense, it didn't need this most recent attack for there already to be ample cause for this kind of discussion. Indeed, you could simply say, let's have this discussion because of the Shoah, because 6 million Jews were cruelly murdered by our enemies for as little good reason. And yet, I think that, again, when there's an individual case where you really can see it clearly and see how sharply we are meant to appreciate that terrible things can happen to truly righteous people, then we have to grapple with that. And our tradition gives us tools to grapple with that, but not, to arrive maybe at easy answers. So there's different ways you could come to examine the question. I think for me, a text that is helpful to start us off is that of what we call Ashrei, which really is this perek, this chapter in Psalms or in Sefer Tehillim that begins Tze'ela David, but then in Tefillah, in prayer, we add Ashrei at the beginning, which is this list of praises for Akadosh Baruch Hu and sort of very powerful, strong, absolute statements about Hashem's righteousness and his mercy. And it's an alphabetic acrostic or an aleph-betic acrostic. So that, pasuk one, or if you remove the Tze'ela David, it starts off with Aromimcha, that's an aleph, and then it goes to a bet, and then a gimel, etc. And it includes all the letters of the aleph bet except for the letter nun, which we can look at in a second. And in it you have psukim that say things like Tzadik Adonai bechol drachav v'hasid bechol ma'asav. Okay, so he is righteous in all of his ways, and he is kind in all of his deeds or actions. Maybe you could ask whether kind is how we want to translate hasid, because hesed is not the same thing necessarily as what hasid might mean, but I think there are other uses of hasid in Tanakh that maybe point that it's something to do with kindness, even if it means something different by the time you get to Chazal, and even something different again by the time you get down through the ages. But if we look at a statement like that, even just, Tzadik Adonai bechol drachav, okay? Righteous is the Lord in all his ways. Well, that's not meant to be an easy one to take at face value, as the real world in which we live roundly shows us, because naively you would say that that's supposed to mean that since Akadosh Baruch Hu is in charge of everything and runs everything and is creator of the world and king of the world, that everything that happens is an expression of his righteousness. But when you look at the events of the world, there are many things you can and should point to and say, I don't understand what is just about that. I don't understand how that could be an expression of the will of a wholly good and wholly just creator of the world. And it's meant to be a provocation. It's not something where, those of faith will never ask the question. That kind of resolution of the theodical puzzle is one that has, was more popular either in the Holy Roman Empire or, the Islamic world in the Middle Ages. Sometimes this way of looking at things is called kulam and Allah, that you just say, well, if it happened, then it's good because God wanted it to happen and it happened, and therefore it's good. So in a sense, our only job is to overcome our resistance to the notion that something that we see happening could be good, because if it's happened, it's the will of God, and then we just need to affirm its correctness and accept it. And if you do that too simply, then that leads to incredible indifference and cruelty, right? Because then you look at suffering in front of you, you look at apparent injustice in front of you, and you just say, oh, it's already happened. So we already have the stamp of approval from the creator of the world on that. And that means we don't have to question it. We don't have to try to reverse it. We don't have to try to fix it. And of course you can complicate it, you can push back, but I'm just saying that there are people who more or less articulated this kind of a primitive resolution of the theodical challenge. There are still those today who would more or less put forward the same kind of notion. I think one way you can also appreciate that in halakha and in Yahadut, that this is not how we do things, is, both either you can read Sefer Eov and you can see how Akadosh Baruch Hu rebukes the friends of Eov for telling him that his suffering is the result of his sin, because there is just cruelty in that. When you say to someone else that there's just a simple equation and, Hashem is just, so whatever happens to you must be just. So if you're suffering, then it's justice. So don't complain about it or just do tshuva, right? That's not halachically the correct way to handle suffering. That's not what we're bound as others of seeing suffering to that's not how we're bound to act or how we're bound to respond. Or you can also say, in other respects, like there's a lot of attention in halacha paid to the damage caused by lashon hara, that you can cause terrible harm to someone by saying things, even that are true about them, that are negative, and that can still be forbidden. Or chas v'chalila, saying things that are not true, and also are negative. And in a sense, there's kind of a kal v'chomer here, because if you go around like a simple theological logician from the Middle Ages of Europe or the Levant or whatever, then what you'd be saying basically is the fact that a terrible thing happened to a person is in and of itself proof that they have done some terrible thing. So it's like you're spreading an ill report about someone implicitly, merely by making a necessary deduction from the fact of something terrible having happened to them. And so if inventing a slander against someone, or even spreading a negative report about someone that's true, is forbidden because of the harm that it does, then how much more so should it be the case that one might in any way suggest that when a terrible thing befalls an apparently righteous person, that one could in any way suggest, oh well, it must have been Hashem's justice or whatever. You simply can't, right? It's all the more inconceivable. It's obviously slander. It's a very wicked kind of response when you see that kind of suffering and injustice. So, with all that being said, that just makes more of a challenge for us in saying, so this is here in Tehillim. We have this from David HaMelech, Tzadik Adonai bechod achav v'hasid bechod ma'asav. Right? So he is righteous in all of his ways, and he is kind in all of his deeds. So how can we say that, but then somehow not be drawn by the pull of this sort of the logical conclusion of that would lead to this kind of slanderous and cruel response to the suffering or the loss of the innocent and the righteous. So that's the one way of posing the puzzle. You don't need to do it based on Ashrei. There are other sources, that you could equally maybe use. But I think Ashrei establishes the framework for examining this issue pretty clearly, in the sense that, as we mentioned before, it leaves out this letter Nun. And I think the basic point there is that this text only makes sense if part of the picture is obscured. Like you can't see everything right now. Something's missing, right? That it's both sort of admitting that there must be some kind of part of the story that's not being told here in order to just say all these nice things about Akadosh Baruch Hu, but not have to deal with all of the messiness of the world and the terrible things that happen to people in the world, sometimes to righteous people. Or you could even also say, like, this is not going to make sense because you don't see part of the picture, right? That if you could see everything, if you could see things how Hashem sees it, then you would understand why this is true. But you won't understand why it's true because part of the picture is withheld from you or is obscured from view. And we can talk a little bit more about what that might mean. But I think that that's the basic framework we want to work with here is, what can it mean that there is a sense in which it is fair to say that Akadosh Baruch Hu is wholly righteous, but that there's going to be a problem for us with finding it easy to accept that statement based on the evidence we have available. What are the implications of that? What is that referring to? And I think there's a there maybe are two natural suggestions to make. And one of them we've a little bit already dealt with, but now we can zoom out a little bit and sort of start at the top. You look around the world, lots of different things happen to people, some good things, some bad things. Some bad things must be happening to people who there's no conceivable way in which you'd want to say they've done anything wrong to deserve what's happening to them. And some bad things happen to people, maybe where, if you had all the facts, you would say, okay, maybe there is some kind of midah, keneged midah here. But you, in any case, don't have all of that information, right? So at a first level, you simply don't have the ability to look around the world and really judge who deserves what. And you shouldn't imagine that you do. And so one appropriate response is just to say, look, part of the picture is missing. So I'll trust that Hashem is being righteous, but I don't really know exactly on what basis, and it's not my business. And anyway, halachically, it's not my job to pile on when something bad happens to someone. So, I won't let it bother me. And that will get you a certain distance, but there's something still troubling about that because of the cases where it just seems so sharply discordant, right? That maybe there are instances where you say, look, people don't know all the details of my life. I don't know all the details of other people's life. I'll let Akadosh Baruch Hu work out exactly what's fair and who gets what. And I'll trust that he has it in hand. And then maybe I'll be a bit less bothered that I can't quite square exactly why, this guy won the lottery and this other one is, his house washed away in a flood or something like that, right? But when you come to these extreme cases, right, where this isn't just, it's a process and there are ups and downs and you have to trust that things will be okay and Hashem will show you the way, right? But then when people sometimes terribly and seemingly irrevocably, although, we'll return to that because obviously we have to talk about Techiyat Metim in due course, when people die, then there are instances where that occurs where it's not remotely conceivable or acceptable to think of this in terms of, I'll let HaKadosh Baruch Hu, sort out the question of who had that coming or something. You can't. It doesn't. It's not equal to the task because there are some cases where you just know there are wonderful, decent, righteous, good, kind, caring people who keep mitzvot, who love Hashem, who dedicate their lives to Hashem and to the land of Israel and to their people and all by any standard from within Torah that you could invent, where you said, look, there's a lot of different things that are expected of people, right? And I'm not to say that, somehow only if you check all those boxes are you supposed to be immune, but I'm saying that there are examples of people where the people who know them know that they are beyond reproach in any way that you could imagine. Of course, everyone has foibles or makes mistakes, but that there's no conceivable way in which there's some kind of calculus in which they have lost, and yet still we lose them. Akadosh Baruch Hu takes them, and when that happens, it's the obviously the personal pain of people connected to them is unimaginable, but even for the nation, for people who seek trust in Hashem and to make that the bedrock of their relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's very shocking. And when you look at the Shoah, obviously the scale of what happened there is so great that it almost is easier at some level with such distance and such magnitude to say, it's all up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But really, if you ever zoom in there and say, okay, these dozen cousins and aunts and uncles and grandparents of my mother, were all of they who perished somehow not measuring up exactly in comparison to some other group of people who survived. I mean, when it's that many people, you know somehow the answer can't be simply that everything already kind of got meted out fairly. So if it isn't that, then what is it? What are we saying? What are we talking about? And I think that's what pushes us towards the second kind of point of like, what is the part of the picture that we're not seeing? And the maybe not totally obvious point, but somewhat obvious point is that the other thing is there's the possibility that we have to consider Olam Haba. We have to consider that the books get balanced in a way that includes what happens after people die. That Akadu Baruch Hu is the ruler and creator of everything, including what happens to people after they die, and that there's some inclusion of that in how we figure out, who's getting what and what's fair. And we don't know what that is, and that's the part of the picture we can't see. And so we have to trust in Hashem in that way. And that, at some level, it certainly removes logical problems in the sense that you could say, if that's what you believe about how things work, then there isn't any reason why that can't balance every ledger, right? You don't know what happens and you don't have any ability to assay that. And so if you're disposed to take it on faith, that that's how things work, then you just say, okay, so Hashem is tzaddik, but some people, they get their reward and punishment more in this life, and some people get their reward and punishment more in the next life. And exactly why he chooses to do it this way for one person and that way for another person, that is another kind of topic, but it doesn't need to bother anyone. But now we can ask, is there something too simple about that way of talking about things? Because you could say, well, but how are you supposed to know that? Is it just there's nothing more compelling than completely unsubstantiated trust, where you say, like, this is an axiom, you have to trust this is true, but there's no evidence you could see in this world that it is true, and because kind of by definition you're not looking into the next world and seeing what happens there, and if that's so, then what is the difference between that and a comforting illusion? Like, if this is, if we're talking about this as though it's like one number, so to speak, and someone's showing you the balance sheet of a company, and they're saying, I promise you the company's profitable, but I'm only going to show you half the transaction, so the balance sheet. And you look at it and you sort of say, well, obviously it could be either, depending on what you're covering up, what you're not revealing, what you're not showing. And the removal of that, the justification for the removal of that doubt has to come from somewhere. And I think, in fact, where that comes from is already subtly suggested in the tradition in a way that does involve Ashrei. Because, interestingly, when you remove the nun from this alphabetical acrostic, the next letter after nun is Samech, and the pasuk in Ashrei, like when we go from Mem to Samech, it's Malchut Dechal Malchut Mimshat Dechal Chud Ovador Somech Noflim Verofe Cholim, right? So Somech Noflim Verofe Cholim means that he is that he supports the fallen. I actually want to get the pasuk exactly right because I'm worried that trying to do it from memory, I just jumbled it. So let's go. All right. Oh yeah, because I was anticipating where I was going with the point, which is we're going to talk about the bracha of Tichat Mitim. But all right, so it's Malchut Decha Malchut Kol Olamim Umimshaltecha Bechol Dor Vador Somech Adonai Lechol Hanoflim Wizokef Lechol Hakfufim. Okay, so your kingdom is everlasting, and your dominion endures throughout all generations. The Lord upholds all who fall, and raises up all those who are bowed down. So this pasuk somech Adonai lechol hanuflim v'zokef lechol hakfufim. The Lord upholds all those who fall and raises up all those who are bowed down. Somech noflim becomes a phrase that's incorporated into the Amidah, the Tefillah, the prayer of the thrice daily prayer for the bracha of Tchiyat Metim, of the revival of the dead. And we say somech noflim v'rofeh cholim u'matir asorim. Hashem he supports the fallen, and he heals the sick, and he sets free the imprisoned. And the point is, I think, when it says he's somech noflim, that is trying to point out to you how you're supposed to, how you're supposed to fill in the blank, right? The nun that's missing, which could refer to nifilah, to falling. We get over to somech Hashem lechol hanuflim. Hashem supports the fallen. We incorporate that into the bracha for Tchiyat Metim, because in the Bar-Hayim for Tchiyat Metim, we're trying to kind of understand how it is that we know something about what Hashem will do for the dead. And what's being argued is, like, you have to look at examples. Like, look at what he does for the fallen. Look at what he does for the sick. Look at what he does for the imprisoned. And that's supposed to kind of point towards what he must also be promising to do for the dead. And yet we know that not everyone who is sick recovers, and not everyone who is in prison escapes or is set free, and not everyone who falls gets back up. So what is this really saying? Like, what is it referring to? And I think that what it points to is more that it calls our attention to the fact that we're not looking at a balance sheet with a number. We're looking at something much more multi-dimensional than that. We're looking at something that has rich, detailed characteristics. We get to see how Hashem acts in this world, right? We look at the whole world that he created. We look at everything that we experience, and there are many opportunities that we get to find relationship with him by seeing his hand in the events that we experience or that we observe in history. And so rather than saying, like, there's a balance sheet and half the transactions are missing and there's one number and it's like going up and down and you don't know, the last number that got added and whether you're in the black or in the red, you have to think of it more like a picture that has patches that are not filled in, right? Or even more like many pictures or many sort of snapshots or many different examples of how someone behaved, even, where in some cases you get to see everything about how they behaved and what they did. And in those instances, you really get to know them. And there are other instances where somehow it's like partly covered up, or it's circumstantial evidence and partly corrupted, and you're struggling to make sense of it. Or to put another way, it's like, here's a bunch of different texts, and some of them you can read them from start to finish and you know what they mean. And in other cases, half the letters have been randomly removed and you're trying to kind of reconstruct what they're referring to, but you know they all came from one author. And the point is that there are these instances where the recognition is clear. You know who the author is, you know what he's saying to you, and it's loud and clear. Or you know who the actor was, you know what he did, and the meaning of that and what it said about his personality and who he was loud and clear. And then there are these other instances where someone says, oh, well, I'm not going to tell you everything, but the same person did such and such. And you don't know the background, you don't know the story, and you're trying to figure out why they did it or how they did it. Or, you're only hearing part of the message, you don't get the whole message, and you're trying to figure out what conclusion to draw. I think that's the more proper comparison. Now, why is that relevant? Because if that's the case, it's like with the somech noflim, the point is sometimes you've seen Hashem lift someone up. It's not just that sometimes people get up. It's that sometimes you saw in the details, in all the details of what was happening, you saw that it was the hand of Hashem that helped someone get back up. And so from those cases, you get to know HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and you know who he is. And if you know who someone is, that is what the basis of trust is for, like, what's that same person going to do in a different situation where now you only have 10% of the details and you're trying to kind of fill in, like, what do I expect in this case? Well, in one case, if you don't know someone, you don't know what they're going to do. And until all the other details are filled in, it's a blank. But in the case where you really know someone, then you could guess a lot about how they're going to act and what would happen. And I think that's the basis on which we go from Somech Noflim to Tchiat Mitim. And that's also, therefore, what back reacts into Ashrei and says, this nun that's missing, this part of the picture that's missing, it's about Tchiat Mitim. It's about the fact that we don't really get to see what HaKadosh Baruch Hu's balance sheet looks like, because it's everything, not just Olam Hazeh, it's also Olam Haba, it's also parts of the picture that we don't see. And it's still in his hands, and it's still up to him. And I think another way of thinking about this is when you think about the words of Kriyat Shema, right? We say, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha bechol levavcha uvechol nafshecha uvechol me'odecha. That you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, or all your, let's say, being, and with all of your soul. I mean, how you translate nafshecha and me'odecha, you could make an issue out of. But the point is that when you love someone, there are at least two different aspects of that may be relevant here. If you really love someone, right? First of all, if you really love someone, you might be willing to work for their sake for a very long time in difficulty without necessarily immediately getting anything in return, because your love is so deep that it has transcended the kind of quid pro quo. I mean, obviously people many times, and for good reason, are in loving relationships where they each give each other things and they each get things out of the relationship, and their love is supported by that sort of mutual exchange of gifts, of, positive contributions or whatever. But there also are instances where people are so confirmed in their love of another individual that maybe, for whatever reason, because of disease, because of circumstances, they're not getting back a whole lot in this particular instance. They may even be, experiencing great pain and tribulation for the sake of, the person they love, but they do it because they love them. And I think that is partly about this idea of trust, and like not saying, well, I love Hashem, but I want immediate feedback about exactly, like, reassurance that this is all going my way and this all makes sense. Part of what we're being asked, in Kriyat Shema, is to develop the capacity to really work, so to speak, for Hashem, for the love of Hashem, for a long time without getting anything back. Like Yaakov worked for the hand of Rachel for years and years, and it was like Yamim Ahadim, it says in the Torah, like a few days for him because of his love of Rachel. There's another aspect, though, which is there is also an imaginable circumstance where a person loves someone else, and because of that love, they both trust that person enough to know that they would do what's right, but also that they are fanatically eager to justify the person that they love, right? That they don't want someone else to suggest that the person that they love could have done something that they did for the wrong reasons. The one who loves this person whose actions are in question will go to great lengths to try to find explanations and imagine extenuating circumstances that explain that person's actions, right? That is the desire to justify the one you love can be part of a very deep love. that you don't want to dismiss someone or judge them or convict them hastily on the basis of scant evidence. You want to insist that they must have had a reason, and I know them, and I trust that they would do what's right, and you think the best of them. And I think that's another aspect of what we're being asked, in terms of how we view Akadosh Baruch Hu. That we are being asked to think about what happens in the world, and on the one hand, to see it as his choice, right? Because he created the world and he rules the world, and the things that happen in his world, like, it doesn't work to say sometimes he's looking the other way and nature did it, or a sort of devil creature did it. Like these kinds of dualistic resolutions of this are for other ideologies, but not for Torah, and not for Yahadut. We have, at the end of the day, to say that everything happens on his watch, but we are bound to put a lot of effort into this process of figuring out, like, how do we be matzdik Hashem? How do we justify Hakadosh Baruch Hu? And that is part of showing love for Hashem, but it's also related to the idea that we know Him well enough to be able to have that trust. Right? We've seen how He acts in this world, and I think that is the fundamental point. That it would be one thing to say, well, we have some evidence that Hashem is really mean and some evidence that Hashem is really nice. Sometimes He does nice things, sometimes He does mean things, and for some reason a bunch of people blindly believe that He's just a nice guy, even though sometimes He does mean things, and we just kind of pretend that those don't count against Him, right? That sometimes can be how it sounds to say He's tzaddik bechol darachav, despite the fact that sometimes monstrous, horrific things happen to good people. Instead, I think it's more, again, like there are instances where we get a very clear look at who Hashem is and what He's doing in this world. And when we get that look, we see who He is, we see how just He is, we see how merciful He is, we see all those things that are said by David in this parak of Tehillim. And then there are these moments where something happens that we just can't easily square with. It's the same personality that's deciding that this other thing happened, this thing that seems monstrous and terrible to us and that seems impossible to justify based on what we know about the people that things can happen to. And I think then the point is to say, that's how we, in a sense, almost, that's how we know there must be some part of the picture that we're not seeing, right? It's almost the best proof, in a sense, that there is a life or a relationship to Hashem that extends beyond the world that we see, because we know Hashem well enough from what we see in this world to trust that when some things that we see in this world don't add up, that's because they're one part of a whole that extends into another world or another existence that we don't have access to. And with that being said, I think it still leaves us this question of why, though, right? Why would Akadosh Baruch Hu do this? Why not just have us see the whole picture and be Himself in a way that we can appreciate in all the instances where we get to see His hand, and what could be the purpose of something that is more complicated than that? And one certainly can't provide answers for that are highly confident, because the whole point is it's something that we're not meant to really know or understand very well. But I do think that there are hints at this that you see if you, first of all, if you just accept the premise of what we're arguing, which is that there is, this part of the picture that we're not seeing. There is this other world, there is some existence or some life beyond Olam Hazeh, this world. Another thing Judaically that you have to immediately add is we are very focused on this world, right? And that's because the Torah wants us to focus on this world. The Torah that Hashem gave us does not say, oh yeah, there's Olam Haba and Olam Hazeh, and it all balances out in these two different places, and some people have more of the resolution of that balancing happening in one world or in another, and what does it really matter? The Torah doesn't mention explicitly, without these very gymnastic readings by Chazal in the Mishnah, the idea of life beyond this world. Now, the Mishnah says if you say that that life beyond death doesn't appear in the Torah itself, then you're a heretic. And so I would not want to say that. However, the whole discussion of that issue in the Talmud is almost kind of making fun of that statement that it itself is making, because in order to find reference to the idea of life beyond death in the Torah, there are these gymnastic, almost distortive readings of the text that Chazal have to carry out in order to kind of, with a play on words or cutting a sentence short or whatever, say, oh, look, it's talking about, the life after death. And they're doing that very transparently and openly, because part of the point there is Akadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want to make this an explicit topic of discussion for a reason. Why? Because who is it who was obsessed with the afterlife? The ancient Egyptians or the medieval Catholic Church, right? There are various instances where you see what it looks like when an ideology becomes focused on the idea that really everything gets resolved in some other world than this. And what happens is people start being obsessed with death, and people start being more disposed to things that look like human sacrifice, and people start being less concerned with fixing problems in this world, because what does it matter? Just move on to the next one where everything will be all balanced out. And so the fantasy of perfection in another world becomes an excuse to accept suffering and misery and cruelty and injustice in this world. And that is not what Akadosh Baruch Hu wants. Akadosh Baruch Hu wants us to focus on this world, to see this world as the main story that we are, is in our hands to affect, and see what we make of it with his Torah to guide us. And so when we view it that way, it becomes a little clearer why we have to deal with things this way. It becomes kind of a two-step thing where it's saying, look, Hashem is just in all his ways, and his ways there have to include some of his ways that maybe extend into Olam Haba or Tchiat Metim, or however you want to put it. But the point is, we're supposed to be in this world, see all the problems in this world, try to fix as many of them as we can, and then we'll fall short and he'll, make up the difference. But he doesn't want us to say, why bother? Just, wait for the veil of this world to be lifted and then let Hashem sort it out, right? Then we won't make progress. We won't progress in our relationship with him. We won't perfect the world that he gave us to perfect. There's all these things that become a problem once the complacency sets in of being focused on the next world. But it's very important that we have that as part of the account we give of what's going on. And again, in a sense, the best proof that it's part of the equation is how well we get to know HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this world, and how much that points out to us that there must be sort of missing pieces of the puzzle that explain what we see in this world as injustice and cruelty and monstrosity and all of that he allows to happen, or in a sense wills to happen as he writes the story. So I think that's one way of making the point. But it's also, I think, not even just enough to say, okay, he wants us to be focused on this world. It's also an issue of, what does he want this world to mean? What does he want it to be? How does he want it to work? And there, I think maybe the best example is, when you look at textual allegories that show you how an ultra-powerful king rules his kingdom. Like in Megillat Esther, for example, Achashverosh, you get all this detail about how orders are sent around his kingdom. And once he sends out these orders, he won't rescind them in order to send other orders that effectively contradict them. Right? He would rather produce different forces that come into conflict with each other from the fact that they're both carrying out his orders than cancel one of his orders because he realized he wants to give another one. And I think that is partly trying to show you what it is to be a true king who rules mightily, right? That you have to be consistent because that consistency is itself part of the creation that you rule, right? That if you as a king constantly rescind your own orders, then your kingdom is chaos by definition, right? It is a choice as king that you're making to let your kingdom be chaos. And Akadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want the world he created to be chaos. He wants the world he created to have structure and to have form, because that's the canvas on which the painting can be drawn, or that's the parchment on which the story can be written. But so whatever narrative requirements Akadosh Baruch Hu has for his story, which includes laws of nature, so to speak, that he mostly doesn't want to fiddle with, once that's established, that means that he's making all of these decisions about how to weave all these threads together in a way that fits the narrative requirements of there being a natural order and there being things that are going to happen when certain conditions obtain, right? Like you can't have people work the way they do biologically, for example, and have it not be the case that sometimes women don't survive delivering a child simply because they go into labor, and that turns out to be a dangerous thing for them. And that was the case for most of human history. It's less often the case now in many societies, but when that calamity would befall someone, in one sense, you can see how it's like, well, that's a requirement of nature that has to happen sometimes, because that's how the world works. And it's very easy for us to ask about any one thing like that. Well, but why did Hashem have to make it that way? Why couldn't he have made it some other way where everything was the same, except that we get rid of frequent death and childbirth by women, 1,000 years ago? But when you keep pulling threads out of creation and saying each one of those, I don't like that one, I don't like that one, I don't like that one, how many do you have to pull out before nothing makes sense anymore and nothing really works according to any kind of order that would provide the basis for a story to be written? And not just any story, but a story about people who live lives that can have meaning, right? Where they can develop relationship with Akadosh Baruch Hu, partly because they live in a world where there are things like fear of death, and where there are things like valor in war, and there are these things that wouldn't exist if the world were already so serene and perfected and peaceful and happy that no one would ever have any cause for alarm or ever have any reason to take risk, etc. So it's very hard to see it all making sense by saying to yourself, oh, well, yeah, it's just that, Akadosh Baruch Hu wants to give us a chance to struggle. It sounds very pat, because this isn't a chance to struggle. We're talking about the worst things that happen to people, and that people's lives can be seemingly irrevocably destroyed by these events that happen to some people and not to other people. And then you can't help but but feel like, why did Hashem have to allow this to happen? And why couldn't it have been some different way? That is another thing that we see in Sefer Eov, that Hashem's answer to Eov partly is just, you didn't set the foundations of the earth. You don't see all the dependencies. You don't see all the different pieces I'm weaving together simultaneously in order to make this world stand up so that the drama that you're a part of can unfold within it. And so I think that it's these two different elements that then work together, right? That on the one hand, Akadosh Baruch Hu has his narrative requirements and his natural requirements. Things he wants to be true about how the world works, and that means there will be, in a sense, be'olam hazeh, casualties of that. But there's another part of the picture that we know has to be there because we see his fingerprints all over the world that we live in, and when we look for them in the right way, and when we have the guidance of the Torah, and when we are trying to understand how he could allow things to happen be'olam hazeh in this world that seem impossible to justify, we can trust that there is another aspect to how this all balances out that we do not have access to. And so it is his choice to create a world in which, for some, there's a lot of sense to how their lives go based on relationship to him, be'olam hazeh, and maybe for others, we couldn't possibly make it make sense without getting to see what happens be'olam haba. And exactly why it goes this way for one and that way for another is certainly beyond and shall remain beyond our ken. Like, it's not a calculus that we can enter into, but it becomes part of what can undergird our trust in Akadosh Baruch Hu, that he has it in hand and he understands, and that doesn't remove the painfulness of it, especially for those who are close to these most unjustified, seemingly, and most cruel and horrific losses. But I think it does point towards a time, Bezat Hashem, when everyone involved will get a chance to see HaKadosh Baruch Hu right the wrongs and balance the scales in time. And that maybe is also something that's referred to actually in this passage in Ashrei, because when you look at the mem and then the nun and the samech and the ayin, so you take away the nun. If the nun had been there, then you would have a nun samech. So there's like a nes at the center of Ashrei, where in order to see it all make sense, it requires a miracle in a sense. Nes is a miracle. So, but the nun is missing. So you're not seeing the nes, which means you're not seeing how this all makes sense. Maybe one day you'll see the nes, you'll see Tchet Mitim, and it will all make sense. But until that point, it won't make sense. And instead, what you have is Mem Samech Ayin, which is Masa, which is a journey, right? There's a Parashat Maseh, right? And Maseh is about the journeys of Bnei Israel with Hashem through the desert. So Masa is a journey. So what we have is we have a journey that we have to go on with Hashem, where we're going to maybe understand more by the time we reach the end of the journey. But the end of that journey may not be be'olam hazeh, it may be be'olam haba. And so we have to have the patience and the emunah to find our way. And that doesn't make it perhaps less painful, or it doesn't remove all the frustration, all the maybe even anger that people might feel with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the state of not getting to see the whole picture, in the state of not getting to understand. But it does at least help us to make more sense of what some of the texts in our tradition are pointing towards. And one last point, this argument about what this is all meaning helped me to make sense or new sense of a Midrash that's famous about the name of Hashem that's given to Moshe when Akadosh Baruch Hu meets him, right? That we'll read the passage in the Torah, and then we can talk about the Midrash. So when Moshe meets Akadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem says to him, "Vayomer Elohim el Moshe, Ehyeh asher ehyeh, Vayomer ko tomar livnei Yisrael, Ehyeh shelachani aleichem." And God said to Moses, "I am that I am," and he said, "Thus shall you say to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you." So there's a midrash, a famous midrash on this point, that when Hashem first identifies himself, he says, "Ehyeh asher ehyeh," is what he's called. I am that I am, or I will be what I will be. And then later, like further down in the Pasuk, it says, Livnei Yisrael, Ehyeh shelachani. He just calls himself Ehyeh instead of Ehyeh asher ehyeh. And the Midrash says, what happened was that Hashem said Ehyeh asher ehyeh because what that meant was, I will be with you for this difficulty, and I will be with you in the next difficulty. And then Moshe said to him, you know what? I don't think people want to hear that there's going to be the next difficulty. Why don't we just say, you'll be with them in this difficulty? And that will be, what people can handle. That they don't want to think about this being cyclical or this being some kind of process where like beyond some inconceivable gap, there's going to be some other trial and some other dayenu or whatever, some other nest that they need, some other splitting of the sea that they need. Let's just focus on what they need now. I think in the past, I've tended to read this Midrash as being more sort of like the dayenu thing, where it's like, we have all these needs. We need the sea to split. We needed Hashem to give us the Torah in the desert. We needed to have the man to eat. We needed to go into the land of Israel. We need to build Beit HaMikdash. And each one of these things like requires miraculous intervention in order to succeed. And if you thought of the whole list of things you have to get through, you would be too faint of heart. So you focus on right now, I need the sea to split. Let's just rely on that. But I think it's another interesting thing because there is this kind of duality to it. It's two. It's not just like a list of things. It's Ehyeh asher ehyeh, and then it turns to Ehyeh. There's also this sense of like, I'll be with you in this current difficulty, Be'olam hazeh, in this world, and I'll also be with you in the next world. And I think Moshe's comment is very poignant in that regard, because what we long for is for Akadosh Baruch Hu to promise us everything will be okay now, right? Everything will be okay in this world. And for some of us, or maybe for all of us sometimes, but certainly for some more than others, that turns out to be true, right? It turns out to be true that you get to see Hashem's deliverance Be'olam hazeh, in this life, and that builds your trust in Him. But there are other times where perhaps you need this sense that Hashem will be with you here in this life and in the next one in order to understand how it all works out and how it all can be okay. But of course, we long for Him to just promise us everything will be okay in this life. And that's Moshe saying, as a human being, like, can we just tell them everything will be okay now? And in the case of Yetziat Mitzrayim, maybe that, at least at a national level, was something Akadosh Baruch Hu was willing to sign up for, right? That at some level, you can think of Paro, the king of Mitzrayim, the king of this material society that harnesses technology and the might of humankind to rule nature and all of that. Paro represents this idea of the natural requirements or the narrative requirements that lead to feeling kind of trapped and oppressed and crushed. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ultimately, his desire is to free us from that. And so he is ultimately on our side in wanting to protect us from as much as possible and to free us from as much as possible the sort of cruelty and implacability of the aspects of creation that seem set against us. But at the end of the day, if we're talking about his most honest account of who he is, he starts with Ehiyeh Asher Ehiyeh, because maybe for some of us more than others, but surely for all of us at the end of the day and at the end of the journey, what we need to know is that Hashem will be with us Be'olam Hazeh, and Hashem will be with us Be'olam Haba, and Tchiat Metim, and everything will be okay, but it may take time and trust for us to walk the whole path with him before we see it.